In the winter of 1972, in a freezing converted farmhouse outside Cologne, a 28-year-old sound engineer sat alone at his mixing console at 3 in the morning, staring at a bank statement that told him he was almost out of money. His name was Dieter Dierks. He had poured every mark he owned into building a recording studio in the tiny village of Stommeln, and now he was about to gamble what little remained on a band that every record executive in Germany had already turned away. They were called the Scorpions. Nobody outside a handful of smoky clubs in the Ruhr Valley had ever heard of them. But Dierks believed he heard something in their raw, unpolished sound that no one else could hear yet, and he was about to bet his entire future on being right. What happened next between this stubborn young producer and a struggling band of unknowns would not just launch a career, it would forge a partnership so deep, so obsessive, so total, that it would shape nearly every song the Scorpions recorded for the next 2 decades, through controversy, through heartbreak, through a singer who nearly lost his voice forever, and through one song that would eventually become the soundtrack to the fall of an empire. But in that freezing studio in 1972, none of that had happened yet. All Dieter Dierks had was a broke studio, an unproven band, and a feeling in his gut he could not explain. He picked up the phone. He called Rudolf Schenker, and he said the words that would change German rock music forever. "Come to Stommeln. Let's make a record nobody believes in yet." To understand why Dierks took that risk, you have to understand who he was. He was not a businessman. He was a tinkerer, a self-taught engineer who had spent his teenage years pulling apart tape machines just to understand how sound could be bent and shaped. While other young Germans in the early 70s were chasing factory jobs or university degrees, Dierks was chasing something harder to explain, a sound that didn't exist yet. He had converted an old farmhouse in Stommeln, a quiet village just outside Cologne, into a working studio, piecing together second-hand equipment, running cables through what used to be a barn. He dreamed of building something that could rival the great studios of London, a place where German bands didn't have to fly to England to sound professional. But dreams like that cost money he didn't have. Every reel of tape, every microphone, every hour of electricity was a debt against a future that hadn't arrived. Friends thought he was reckless. Investors wanted nothing to do with an unproven engineer working out of a barn in the countryside. And yet Dierks kept building, convinced that if he could just find the right band, the right raw material, he could prove what his ears already knew. When word reached him about a hard-driving group from Hannover fronted by a powerful young singer, he didn't hesitate. He drove out to hear them himself, standing in the back of a half-empty club, arms crossed, listening past the poor equipment and the thin crowd to something underneath it all. The band he found that night was still finding its own shape. Rudolf Schenker had founded the Scorpions back in 1965, a teenager obsessed with the British invasion, determined to build a German rock band that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the axe crackling out of his radio. By 1969, he had found his singer, a warm, distinctive voice named Klaus Meine, whose tone had a strange, aching quality that cut through even the roughest recordings. Rudolf's own younger brother, Michael Schenker, just a teenager himself, was already playing guitar with a fire and precision that stunned older musicians. But talent wasn't enough. Record labels in Germany saw nothing but risk in a hard rock band singing in English, competing against slicker, safer acts. Doors kept closing. Rehearsal rooms were cold, van tires went bald, and paychecks from small club gigs barely covered gasoline. By the time Dierks found them, the band was exhausted, scraping together the will to make one real record before everything might fall apart. Dierks made them an offer nobody else would. Come to my studio, even though it's unfinished, even though I can't pay you properly, and I will give you everything I have to make this sound like nothing else on German radio. Klaus Meine later remembered staring at this intense young man promising the impossible and thinking, either he is a genius or he is about to ruin all of us together. The sessions that followed in the early months of 1972 were unlike anything the band had experienced. Dierks did not simply record them. He interrogated every sound. He would stop a take because a cymbal decayed the wrong way, rerouting cables at midnight, chasing a tone he heard only in his head. He experimented with tape delays and unconventional microphone placement, techniques few German studios were even attempting. The band, hungry and a little frightened by his intensity, began to trust him precisely because he refused to settle. Long nights stretched into dawn, coffee replaced by cigarettes, cigarettes replaced by silence as everyone listened back to a mix, waiting for Dierks's verdict. The album that emerged, Lonesome Crow, was moody, heavy, and strange, built from raw performances and Dierks's patient, obsessive layering. When it was finally released, the commercial response was quiet. Radio ignored it. Sales were modest at best. To an outsider, the gamble looked like it had failed. Friends of Dierks whispered that he had wasted a year of his life and nearly all of his money on a band going nowhere. But something else had happened in those sessions that no chart position could measure. A bond had formed. The band had found a producer who heard possibilities they couldn't yet hear themselves, and Dierks had found 5 musicians willing to trust him completely. Neither side knew yet that this fragile beginning was about to be tested by a devastating loss. That test came almost immediately. Michael Schenker, still barely out of his teens, was poached by the British band UFO, who had been stunned by his playing during a support tour. For Rudolf Schenker, losing his own brother from the band he had built felt like a betrayal wrapped inside a triumph. For Dierks, it was a crisis that could have ended everything before it truly began. A band without its lead guitarist, still unproven, still broke, could easily have dissolved right there in Stommelen. Instead, Dierks pushed Rudolf and Klaus to look toward a fiery young guitarist named Uli John Roth, whose playing carried the unmistakable influence of Jimi Hendrix, all sustain and searing melody. Roth joined, and in the studio, Dierks found a new canvas. Together they built Fly to the Rainbow in 1974 and In Trance in 1975, records that began to define what people would soon call the Dierks sound. Layered guitars stacked like cathedral glass, atmospheric productions that felt cinematic rather than simply loud, ballads that ached with a strange, aching beauty next to riffs that hit like a fist. Dierks was no longer just recording the band. He was co-writing arrangements, shaping songs from skeletal ideas into fully realized statements. In Trance, in particular, signaled a turning point, the moment critics stopped dismissing the Scorpions as a regional curiosity and started calling them one of the most interesting hard rock bands in Europe. The gamble Dierks made in that freezing barn was finally starting to pay dividends. But bigger storms and much bigger controversy were only a year away. In 1976 came Virgin Killer, an album that pushed the band's sound further into darker, more theatrical territory, all courtesy of Dierks's increasingly ambitious production choices. But it was the album's cover that ignited a firestorm, an image so controversial that it was pulled and replaced in numerous countries almost immediately, dogging the band's reputation for years afterward. Dierks and the Scorpions weathered the backlash together, doubling down on the music itself as their answer, releasing Taken by Force in 1977, a harder, more urgent record. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Uli Roth had always been a searcher, spiritually restless, drawn more toward long, exploratory instrumental passages than toward the tighter, hook-driven songs that Dierks and Klaus Meine increasingly believed were the band's true future. The tension in the studio grew quiet but unmistakable, two visions of what this band should become pulling in different directions. After a triumphant but exhausting live album captured on tour in Japan, Roth made his decision. He was leaving to pursue his own musical path. For Dierks, it was another gut-punch loss of a guitarist he had helped shape into a virtuoso. For the band, it raised a terrifying question that had haunted them once before. Could the Scorpions survive losing their guitar hero for a second time? Rudolf Schenker sat with Dierks late one night in Stomeln, staring at an uncertain future, wondering if this was finally the end of the road they had started walking together 6 years earlier. It was not the end. In 1978, a young guitarist named Matthias Jabs auditioned for the band, and Dierks, ever the talent scout with sharpened instincts, immediately recognized something special in his precision and fire. Jabs joined, and briefly, almost improbably, Michael Schenker returned to guest on select tracks, bridging the band's past and its uncertain present in the same sessions. Around this time, Dierks made his boldest investment yet, expanding his humble farmhouse studio into a full professional complex, determined to give his band, now truly his band in every sense, a home worthy of what he believed they could become. The result was Love Drive, released in 1979, an album that finally cracked open the international market, climbing onto American charts for the first time and introducing the Scorpions to a global audience hungry for their sound. Songs like Loving You Sunday Morning showcased a new sophistication, melodic yet muscular, polished yet still dangerous. Rolling Stone and other major outlets that had never given the band a second glance were suddenly paying attention. After years of setbacks, betrayals, and controversy, the gamble Dierks made in that freezing barn in 1972 was finally, unmistakably, paying off. The Scorpions were no longer a regional curiosity. They were becoming a genuine international act. But just as momentum was building toward the biggest decade of their career, a devastating and deeply personal crisis threatened to silence the one voice that made it all work. By 1981, as the band prepared what would become Blackout, Klaus Meine developed severe vocal cord problems, the kind of injury that ends careers permanently. Doctors delivered devastating news. There was a real possibility he might never sing again, not just at full power, but at all. For any other producer chasing a hit record on a deadline, the practical solution might have been obvious and ruthless. Bring in a new singer and keep the momentum going. Dierks refused even to consider it. He believed in Klaus Meine's voice, the same way he had believed in this unproven band back in 1972, completely and without hedging. He put the album on hold. He supported Meine through surgery and a grueling, uncertain recovery, months of silence, of whispered exercises, of not knowing if the voice that had carried a decade of songs would ever return. When Meine finally stepped back into the vocal booth at Dierks's studio, the tension in the room was suffocating. He opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not just recovered, it was stronger, more controlled, carrying a new depth born from everything he had feared losing. Blackout, released in 1982, became the band's breakthrough, driven by a title track and a ballad, Now You're Gone, that captured raw survival in every note. Dierks had bet on loyalty over convenience, and it had just saved the most important voice of his career. What followed was the golden run neither man could have imagined back in that cold Stoneman farmhouse. Love at First Sting, released in 1984, became a phenomenon, propelled by Rock You Like a Hurricane, a song built in Dierks's studio with a ferocity and clarity of production that translated perfectly to the new era of MTV and stadium rock. The ballad, Still Loving You, became an anthem of its own, played in arenas across continents, a slow-burning centerpiece of every Scorpions show. Dierks, still the same obsessive perfectionist chasing sounds only he could hear, had by now built one of the most respected studios in Europe, pioneering drum sounds and guitar tones that other producers openly copied. Tours stretched across America, Japan, and beyond, arenas packed with fans who, a decade earlier, had never heard of a hard rock band from Hannover. Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker often said in later years that Dierks was, in every meaningful sense, the sixth member of the band, present in every arrangement decision, every guitar tone, every vocal take, a silent architect standing just behind the spotlight. The farmhouse gamble of 1972 had grown into an empire of sound. And yet, the most extraordinary chapter of this two-decade partnership, the one that would carry Dierks and the Scorpions beyond music entirely and into world history, was still ahead of them. In the summer of 1989, the Scorpions performed at the Moscow Music Peace Festival, one of the first Western rock acts to play before a massive Soviet audience during the final, trembling months of the Cold War. Klaus Meine stood on that stage and felt something shifting in the air, a sense of change so tangible it felt like electricity. Later that year, the Berlin Wall came down, and the world Dierks and the band had grown up in, a Germany split in two, began to dissolve in real time. Back in the studio, working on what would become the album Crazy World, Meine brought Dierks a fragile, almost whispered melody inspired by that trip to Moscow, a song about hope carried on the wind. Dierks, the man who had once bet his last savings on an unknown band in a freezing barn, now poured everything he had learned across 18 years of partnership into producing this one delicate track with extraordinary care. Wind of Change, released in 1990, became far more than a song. It became the unofficial soundtrack to the end of the Cold War, embraced across a reunifying Europe, a whistled melody that carried the weight of history in its simplicity. It stands as one of the best-selling singles by a rock band in history. 2 decades after Dierks first called Rudolf Schenker with an offer nobody believed in, The partnership born in that broke, freezing studio had produced a song that soundtracked the fall of an empire. The barn in Stommel was gone, replaced by professional studios that echoed with 2 decades of history. But the gamble that started it all, one broke producer's faith in an unproven band, had paid off beyond anything either man could have dreamed that freezing night in 1972.